Hello, everyone. Mnar Adley here, founder and director of MintPress News. I'm excited to be joined today by Coleen Rowley here in Minneapolis. She is a 9/11 whistleblower working with the FBI, and she testified in the 9/11 inquiry about the FBI and the U.S. government, the Bush administration, having foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks before they happened. Coleen, welcome to the show.
Yes, thanks for having me.
So we have a lot to talk about today. And we're going to talk about the war on terror from 9/11, your experience standing up to the U.S. government, to becoming a whistleblower. I also want to talk about ICE escalation and the bipartisan support for this machinery's state terror, and even the Epstein files and this new dystopian tech surveillance system that we're all living under. But first, let's begin talking about your history and your background as an FBI whistleblower, having written, this massive document as part of the 9/11 inquiry.
In 2001, there was so much information and intelligence flooding into not just the FBI, but especially the CIA, because they had been surveilling the hijackers for almost 2 years beforehand. They had failed to tell the FBI, and in fact, they even covered up afterwards everything. They even got FBI agents to lie to the official inquiries. Incredible, because they had a lot of information. In fact, the 9/11 Commission says the system was blinking red, and the CIA director's hair was on fire. There was so much information. Now, after 9/11, when Bush and Condi Rice and Dick Cheney were sitting on a veranda plotting how they would now have the pretext to start the new Pearl Harbor, which they had been hoping for some time, since the early 90s. They had said, if we ever get our chance and the country is sufficiently prepared through some kind of trauma like Pearl Harbor, then we'll launch our series of wars. So while they're sitting there coming up with this, and this is not me saying this is now written in books. Even Richard Clarke, who was the counterterrorism czar, has said that, he went up to Bush day after 9/11 and Bush says, we're going to war in Iraq. Unbelievable. So, but people didn't know that actually they had all of this intelligence. And if the agencies had shared with each other, so if the CIA had told the FBI there were 2 hijackers in California, which they knew about, if the agency, our FBI, had forwarded the information from our agents in Minnesota, who had 2 whistleblower pilot instructors call them and say, we have the most suspicious flight student we've ever seen. And then they immediately investigated. They found those connections to terrorism. In fact, it was a Chechen terrorist who was entwined with bin Laden. And they found this out very quickly. And then they tried to have an emergency request for a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act search of the personal effects, which if they had searched quickly, there is at least a good chance that they could have stopped 9/11 that way. But there's also another way, which if they had shared the information with the public, and this is not me talking, that's actually the 9/11 Commission's conclusion, is that this was a lack of information sharing, and especially with the public, because if the public had known, then they would have been able to stop it as well. There's a whole bunch. And by the way, these hijacker Al-Qaeda were very suspicious. There were lots of people, just like our Minneapolis agents, that had spotted things, even in flight training, etc. So, FBI Director Mueller goes out and says, we didn't have any idea what was going to happen, or maybe we could have tried harder. He said something like, I went, oh my gosh, and so then a few months after this, after Dick Cheney was unsuccessful in stopping the Joint Intelligence Committee from finally looking into what had gone wrong. And it started in the early 2002, and there was this kind of cover up. They had created a false timeline and all these things. So when I got a chance, I wrote a memo, a 12-page memo to FBI Director Mueller, but also to the senators on the committee directly. And I delivered it that day, and somehow it leaked to the press. And then after that, 2 weeks later, I testified to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that served to launch an Inspector General investigation and that's only for the FBI, of the FBI's failures. So I was really kind of and then even the 9/11 Commission, which the families were pushing for, but my role in that probably helped too to push for the 9/11 Commission. Now, the problem is all of those conclusions that came out of these official inquiries, by the way, some of which remain covered up. The Saudi Arabia 28 pages remain covered up all for many years. That didn't even come out. But even though some of the information finally came out, it was too late. They had already started to launch the project to start war in Iraq. And that just, because it was already pre-planned. And
yeah. Well, that's what I was going to ask is, what you provided the evidence for didn't seem to matter, because from there, the Bush administration launched 2 horrific wars, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's almost like it was a pre-planned proposition.
Well, they had, when they make plans, there's plan A, plan B, plan C. And it's a well-known axiom that, and this was once said by a famous, I don't know if he's famous, but Congressman Rahm Emanuel, who worked for Obama, I think in the Obama administration. He said, "We never let a catastrophe go to waste." So if you're in that mindset, you're always looking for a pretext that you can use then for something that you actually have already planned. And it's well known now that this series of wars, and we know it from many different sources, but a series of wars in the Mideast for Israel's purposes, to make Israel the main regional power, was taking out one country after another. And a lot of people will say that, you didn't succeed, but they did succeed in destroying much of the Iraq, Syria, Libya, a lot of those countries that, it didn't help the people, obviously. We were lied to in the United States, and we were told we were trying to free Libya from Gaddafi and free Iraq from Saddam and all these things. But the people of the countries really suffered, and many of them were killed. But that actually suited the United States' purposes for gaining this regional power in that area. And the last country that was left on this list, that again, I'm not making this up, Wesley Clark General, this comes from many sources, remains Iran.
Yes.
So that's where we're at right today. It took them, they thought they could do it in 5 years. So now we're at 2001 till now, 25 years.
Yeah.
So they thought they could do this all in 5 years. So that was ambitious.
Yeah, that's hubris right there.
But they are on the last step right now. And that's the sad thing, because it's so dangerous and so I warned. So going back to my role is after I realized that this was going to happen in February of 2003, that this lie to start war on Iraq, and they were saying it was because Saddam was aligned with Al-Qaeda. They had 70% of the country believing in February of 2003, Saddam, who really was an enemy of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. All the intelligence knew that. He was an enemy of Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 terrorists. But no, 70% of the Americans thought he was the same. They didn't understand the difference. And even a year or two later, the polls still showed that they had been duped to think that fighting in Iraq somehow had something to do with 9/11. Anyway, I wrote a memo to FBI director at the end of February, and he never responded, even though he had promised to respond. So then I took it to the New York Times, and that memo warning that the Iraq war would be one of a first, I didn't use the term imperial boomerang, but I should have. I should have used that term. I warned that it would be counterproductive and it wasn't justified. And it made the front page of the New York Times, one of just a few warnings about Iraq war. And that was in March, early March. And then, of course, we went ahead and did the war. And now we're at where we are.
And it's interesting that you mentioned all the countries that Wesley Clark laid out, because you warned that not only is the United States going to continue these imperial wars, of course, for the sake of Israel, right? But a lot of these policies, these war on terror policies, were going to come back home to roost. So do you see that happening?
Exactly. When that same memo, and I kind of tried to think of every valid argument I could, because the war fever in February of 2003, it was so high in the United States. All of our NBC, CBS, all of our mainstream press had sent their reporters to the carriers to talk to the soldiers. I want to go in, all this. And so this kind of thing gets people crazy. And actually in the United States, like I said, they led them to believe completely something false. So I knew it wasn't going to be a popular warning. And I threw everything in there I could. One of the things I put in there was that this preemptive use of force. Under international law, the supreme crime is a war of aggression. You cannot just say, I want to conquer Iraq. And now we say Venezuela and Greenland and all these other places. But if you go back to Nuremberg principle after World War II, that was the main crime, is that Germany was aggressing. This wasn't in self-defense. Well, self-defense is also the legitimate use of force for a law enforcement officer. Yeah, if somebody's going to shoot you and pointing their gun at you, that's what we train for. We give legal lectures. I did this for 13 years, gave legal lectures about the proper, legitimate use of deadly force in defense of your own life, or in the defense, if you were a sniper, if you saw someone going to kill someone else, a third party. And we trained on electronic machines on this. So now we're being told from our government, we don't have to do a war in self-defense. We actually can launch the war in a war of aggression. That's preemptive. Mm-hmm. And so I made that comparison in my memo or my letter to Mueller. And yes, and then when Renee Good was killed that day, I said, well, this is the exact example of what I warned, a loosened standard of deadly force. And in a war zone, and the worst example, of course, is some massacre like My Lai, but also Haditha in Iraq. There's been many of these massacres. And, people obviously get carried away and they're mad. And when the boss, in the case of My Lai, it was this officer Callie, lined up women and children next to a ditch and said, shoot. And everybody follows the orders. And the only one who didn't follow the orders was a guy up in a helicopter, Hugh Thompson, who looked down and went, what is going on? So I've studied those examples, and I know that the loosened the loosened standard for use of deadly force would eventually migrate back even to the FBI and to law enforcement. And when I put that and it made the front page of the news, the FBI agents around me just hated me. How could you say that? How could this ever happen? This will never happen. And then with the shooting of Renee Good, I said, oh my gosh, it's happened. It takes a while. Because these things, people take the cue from the leadership, also the hiring and people constantly training on violent video games, which is a recruiting tool for the military, and then law enforcement. And so it takes a few years for this all to migrate here, but that's certainly what has happened now. And we are witnessing war zone tactics being employed right in Minneapolis and in Minnesota and other cities.
And, I grew up, I'm a product of the post 9/11 America, watching the Bush administration launch these wars and seeing the Patriot Act come into force, and then seeing also the militarization of our police forces taking place after 9/11. And so, I'm also having kind of a full circle moment, having been reporting on these issues for over a decade now. And some would argue that this is not necessarily new, right? It's just that right now people are, because it's affecting the white American, now people in the suburbs of Minnesota and in Minneapolis are really terrified about the police state. But this has been going on for a very, very long time. I mean, look at ICE. It's headquartered in Tel Aviv, right? The ICE headquarters are in Tel Aviv. That's really bizarre. And of course, the FBI and a lot of law enforcement and a lot of the tactics that ICE are using is coming from the Israeli military.
Yes.
So we can't talk about, U.S. imperialism and this police state system without really talking about this Israeli influence of bringing these tactics to our land here. Do you agree?
Yeah, it was slow evolving.
Yeah.
There were some glimpses of this militarization with, for instance, law enforcement, county sheriffs, police chiefs getting tanks. There was military surplus. And so during the Republican National Convention, you saw them in that gear. That was back in 2008.
I remember.
So they were all in that's kind of that same gear. They were lobbing chemical, weapons and bombs, and there were tanks and things like that on the side. So that was a glimpse, but it only lasted a couple of days. And so this militarization has been happening. I'll tell you, and from personal experience, after 9/11, and this is the connection to Israel, there were I don't know if they were Israeli Americans, or they weren't calling me directly from Israel, I don't think. But I got 2 or 3 calls at least from people saying, oh, now that you've had your own terror attack here, you're going to have to adopt the same methods that Israel employs. And I this was, again, within days of 9/11. I got these calls and people would say, I'm an expert. Like I remember one was a canine expert. You're going to have to get all your dogs trained for bomb sniffing now, because now you're the victim of terrorism, just as we in Israel are. And so that was one. Later, this wasn't right after 9/11, we had these Israeli, I don't know if they were IDF or they probably were, and they would come and be speakers. And then the police chiefs would go over to Israel also on these junkets and tours and some joint training things. But the speakers that I remember the most, one was actually in a law school in Washington, D.C., talking about the ticking time bomb rationale for use of torture. So this is that there's a ticking time bomb. You make this up, by the way. You concoct a hypothetical. There's a ticking time bomb in New York City. By the way, sitcoms adopted this afterwards, the ticking time bomb. There's a ticking time bomb. It's going to take out New York City, and you have the guy who knows where it's been hidden. So shouldn't you get that information out of the guy, no matter what it takes, in order to save the city? Now, this is it became a common plot, but I remember the first times it was said, and I was even with other law professors. I was with other law professors. One was a female law professor from California, and she said, yeah, that makes sense to me. That's utilitarian. And so this kind of thing, and Al Dershowitz wrote op-eds about it. Guess what? Within a year and a half of 9/11, John Yoo in Department of Justice wrote memos authorizing torture. So you see how quickly, in some ways, we can turn really, into monsters overnight and violate all of what we thought were strong laws. And then, by the way, much of it not rescinded. And it wasn't even the Patriot Act, because before the Patriot Act, Patriot Act didn't do as much as the memos. The memos in the Department of Justice were written saying, well, now the law doesn't matter as much because we're in a war on terrorism. And First Amendment, freedom of press, whatever, that's going to take a back seat now. Because we have to do things, and we're not going to necessarily be honoring all of our civil liberties, kind of as if it's a luxury. Those are right in the memos, and they've never been rescinded after 9/11. People have forgotten it's long ago, but that set the groundwork for where we're at today. But going back to the slow evolving, absolutely. But the militarization, also the hiring of all, usually, in the FBI, we had a diverse hiring. I worked with people that had been forensic people. One had been cancer researcher. A guy in my class had been a cancer researcher, veterinarian. I mean, engineers, teachers. I had two or three teachers, all different walks of life. I had come out of law school. So people I were all after 9/11 pretty much hired, pretty much focused on military, and people who had been really ingrained in war zone type situations. So that over time changes the whole complexion of your law enforcement as well, is that you have a higher proportion. Look at the ads that they put out for ICE. What were they looking for? They weren't looking for teachers. They didn't say, if you're a history teacher, please apply to ICE. If you understand history, no, they said, if you're in the military, patriot, and whatever, please apply.
And that brings us back to Alex Preddy, who was like a veteran nurse, treating veterans, and he was still targeted by ICE. And now it can be argued that he was almost hunted by ICE.
Well, there had been a prior run-in, and no one knows exactly the facts of that. We were shown a little short clip of Preddy, and he apparently got a broken rib by being pushed down before this. So that obviously when people have been the victim of force, that's going to do something to them as well. And, thinking, I defy anyone, if you're being pummeled, not to fight back either. I mean, that's the problem with being in a situation like this. It is self-defense at that point. You're trying to protect your head and everything. And if you look at the video, which I recommend should be shown to grand juries right now, those videos should be shown to grand juries, because they are the best evidence. And again, you see his hands out in front of him, again, trying to put his head down to protect himself. And then they yell, gun, gun. And, somebody made a mistake at that point because they heard the word gun. That's all really it took. And then boom, 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 10 shots were fired. And mistakes, I'm going to say one thing about law enforcement, because unless the movies and the stupid TV shows that have constantly portrayed law enforcement as if everyone's Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. and you can shoot the hand. We even saw this with old cowboy shows. You shoot the gun out of their hand. I went through all this training and I got killed by the darn electronic screen more times than I was able to do it, because it's really difficult. And, the female police officer who thought she was grabbing her taser and then actually grabbed her gun and shot and killed someone. And as soon as she realized she had made the mistake and hadn't gotten her taser, she was trying to kill herself, because it is a horrible thing to have that responsibility of always carrying a loaded gun and then thinking you can use it correctly. So mistakes are made. The problem with this thing, no accountability.
I was about to say,
that's the problem.
The Trump administration is currently blocking the investigation from locally happening here.
Well, they've relented. It's not clear. They were reported to have relented on Preddy. And Preddy was shot by two, it looked like either Mexican-American or Latino-American, finally when they were identified, because they weren't identified forever. But it looks like that's who did it. And I think they have claimed that they're allowing the BCA, who are the experts in any kind of a deadly force incident. They've investigated hundreds of local and state deadly force incidents in the state. The FBI, to my knowledge, when I was in, I can't even remember one investigation of deadly force. And yet you heard Kristi Noem and all of them say, no, we won't let the state investigate. Only the feds can investigate. And then I think they even took it away from the FBI after the female supervisor resigned in protest. The female supervisor at the FBI resigned when she heard this. And so did initially 6 assistant U.S. attorneys, including the acting U.S. attorney, who was apparently ordered to not allow the state to investigate and to also investigate the victims of the shooting. I mean, can you imagine anything more awful? And then to their credit, they walked out, those 6, and then 8 more have. So it's like a total of 14, and even more at the Department of Justice in Washington. When people say, well, it's so terrible, the situation we're in, I go, well, there is some glimmers of integrity. And that, I know that those people who resigned, I think, show that there are still some people who just cannot stomach when it goes down to this level, a low level. But now the question that remains, that I did hear that they're going to allow the BCA to investigate the shootings of shooters of Preddy, but I haven't heard if they're allowing the BCA to investigate the Ross is his last name, Ross's shooting of Good. And they're both of these, if you look at the videos, they are not justified. And in fact, Ross was well trained. He was a firearms expert. He was a SWAT team leader. I don't think he is Mexican American. I think he probably is somebody they want to protect. He had like 50, and he came from Iraq war zone. Mm-hmm. He had worked in Iraq war zone. So I think that maybe they are not. I don't know for sure if they're allowing the BCA to investigate that one. I mean, that's what reporters should be finding out right now, because it should be both. And they should, the BCA should do their investigation of both of these. Then the prosecutors, not just the federal prosecutors, but the state prosecutors, the county prosecutor, should evaluate it just as they do in any other case. And after they evaluate it, they should take it to their grand juries and let us, the average people, say, oh my gosh, that is, because it seems to be right now that they have realized, Kristi Noem initially trying to protect and saying, oh, domestic terrorists, and trying to say that all Minnesotans are insurrectionists. Yeah. And just because of the sanctuary city, they tried to besmirch all of the citizens of Minnesota and use that as if you're part of the problem. And since you're part of the problem and you're harboring this, then you're the enemy as well. That's very similar to a war zone where you say the civilians, they did this in Vietnam. That's why they torched the village of My Lai. They said all those people are helping the Viet Cong. So we just set fire to all the huts. And you think about it, it's very similar to what they're doing in Minnesota, claiming that we're the enemy.
And I was just about to ask you, why do you think this is happening in Minnesota? Because it does feel like they've turned our state into this ground zero for this federal agent insurrection here. I mean, we have people from the far right, these paid agitators flying into our state to provoke people. And the reason I brought up Alex Preddy's background, being somebody who was a nurse who treated veterans, is because he's the perfect example of like the average Minnesotan who's opposed to what these federal agents are doing. This is not a left or right issue. I mean, people in this state have come together from all walks of life. Democrats and Republicans, even conservatives, have come to stand, shoulder to shoulder in the streets of Minneapolis to oppose this federal invasion, because they see that they're not following constitutional law. They're breaking. Even our federal judge here, or our state judge, our top judge here in Minnesota, who is a Republican, I think he has worked with the Bush administration in the past. I mean, he said these federal agents, ICE, they are violating so many laws. They're violating the Constitution.
Yeah, the glimmer of hope in the fact that people with integrity have even left their jobs because they're not going to be a part of this. And on top of that, the judges, our judicial system, sure, when you're nominated and then appointed by a president of a certain party, the thought is you will always rule in the favor of that president. Okay, no, it's not true. Some do. Some are kind of blinded by everything and they continue to rule in certain ways. However, especially in this case, you are seeing many Trump appointed judges that are saying the same thing as, like I said, our acting U.S. attorney and the candidate for governor. That candidate for governor who pulled out because of what's going on with ICE had actually been on the side of the police. He had done lawsuits and stuff defending police actions. And he said this is too much. I mean, those are very telling tipping points.
Yeah.
And again, when you get this nonpartisan, finally people realize they have some principles. But you're right. It's a slow thing. It's very slow to see happen when you're living in the midst of it. And right now we're looking at, this call for reform, and it's not a tipping point. It's not yet a tipping point for sure.
Well, and Democrats on before we even get to Democrats on the national stage, I think a big part of what's happening is trying to keep people divided between left and right. But really, if you're on the ground, you'll see that people who would normally vote Republican are actually opposed to this. And so what Trump is doing is really not representative of even some of the local Republican constituency here, especially in the state of Minnesota. And then Democrats like to come in and, they like to swoop in and try to pretend like they're the resistance, right? Kamala Harris is talking about, running again and, using her, I think that she said during her campaign, which if we remember, she campaigned on the fact that there was no genocide in Gaza.
Right.
And here she is trying to come in again with other Democrats to swoop in and say, like, we're going to save America from these fascist Republicans. But it was like Obama who deported over 3 million immigrants. It was the Biden administration that funded and armed the genocide. And it was these democratic institutions that built the immigration centers, the detention centers for children, for migrant children that Trump is putting them in. So it's almost like they create the toolkit, right, for the Republicans to kind of take over and continue these escalatory plans, whether it's cracking down on immigration, which, by the way, if we can't tell by now, this has nothing to do with immigration.
Right, exactly.
This is really just, yeah.
Well, the main telling thing that it's not anything to do with immigration per se is that Minnesota doesn't even have the percentage of immigrants. It's a very small fraction compared to Texas, Florida, California. So if this whole speech, this campaign promise of, I'm going to deport all of the immigrants, whatever, you would never come to Minnesota first. You would have gone. You would have sent the forces down. And I'm not advocating because I will get to that. But, obviously they have all of these agents now. If they do reduce the number in Minnesota, and hopefully we talk some more about this later, where are they going to go? Mm-hmm. Because they can't fire them. There's 22,000 ICE agents alone, more than doubled. When we were talking, you said it slowly happened, but it did happen. One thing happened quickly. The year 2005, after Trump's election, again, put out the ads. They solicited 220,000 applicants to apply to ICE. And they hired 12,000. In fact, they brag about this. This is in press releases. They took the number of ICE agents from 10,000 to 22,000 overnight. And that part was quick. And then sent them. And here's another really odd question that I don't see media asking. Why is Border Patrol is additional? They're separate.
Yeah.
Border Patrol is another 20,000 or more.
Why are they here?
So we have, Border Patrol, if you look at the law itself, they're not to go more than 100 miles from the border. They're supposed to be in Minnesota, it would be the Canadian border. Down in Texas, it would be the Mexican border. They're not supposed to leave over 100 miles. If they're in hot pursuit or something, they can go a little ways, but they can't go very far. Why are they in Minneapolis?
That's what I'm saying.
And I think
why are they here?
The shooters were Border Patrol rather than ICE. So that's a good question. And they have ways, they find loopholes and they're able to make a regulation or an executive order. But if you look at the numbers that were increased overnight, and there's no real so-called immigration problem in Minnesota. There are immigrant populations here, but many of them have been here for a long time. They are working hard and, they've got children in school and 20 years paying Social Security, everything else. So, and they're actually doing many of the jobs, hard jobs that a lot of people are loath to do, and even if you look at California, all of the agriculture that is sustained through different migrant visas and things that you can get, this is all this is so counterproductive in a million ways. But once this happens and you send people here, and it went up at least to 3,000, and I don't know if that's border and ICE or it's a mixture. It's hard to know. But the Brian O'Hara, the police chief of Minnesota, is on an interview saying that before the Trump metro surge, the whole state of Minnesota had 150. If you do the math, 150 ICE beforehand, now 3,000. Mm-hmm. That's 20 times. And this is where I lectured about unlawful orders. And again, I already brought up My Lai. But when people are in situations where they're given unlawful orders, we could have talked about, like the senators talked about bombing the fishing boats or whatever boats they were next to Venezuela, said don't follow unlawful orders. I mean, there's no evidence. You don't even know who they are. Well, president ordered you to. Cali ordered you to shoot the women. And so we're in this, this tension where following orders, and the senators tried to warn. What did they do? Oh, they're going to take away his Navy, Kelly's pension, because he said, that you shouldn't follow. And by the way, we're not supposed to follow on after Vietnam and all these other things. The military is trained not to follow unlawful orders. I once spoke at the Naval Academy in 2004 or 5, and that naval helicopter pilot who had tried to stop the massacre at My Lai up in his helicopter, he looked down, he tried to land it so that people could run, and I think some did get away, not many, but some got away, and he was ostracized by the Navy for a little while. In later years, the Naval Academy brought him to speak to their cadets because they wanted to teach them not to follow unlawful orders. So we thought this was, well known. And then all of a sudden, these ICE agents are sent here. Initially, they were actually told a memo went out. There was a quota. There was a quota that they were supposed to get, 1,000 a day or something. So of course, your judgment and the targeting of the worst goes up in smoke. How can you target when you have this quota set for you? So afterwards, they said, maybe it's a bad idea to put out a public quota. They also initially said that they'd get a bonus. If whoever got deported quickly, they'd get like a couple $100 extra on top of the 50,000 for deporting somebody quickly. Well, and then someone said, don't do that, because you're supposed to use, if the people who actually do have serious criminal histories, which is what Trump promised, he seemed to say that, it's a crime problem. So therefore, rapists and murderers and whatever, and most of those were already in jail. So if you had somebody who had come here illegally and had murdered and or committed a sex offense or whatever, they were already in jail. Mm-hmm. So it was all kind of a deception to use to make people okay with this mass roundup, which was indiscriminate. It didn't. And again, the other thing was breaking down the doors of houses without a Fourth Amendment required probable cause warrant. Why? Why didn't they have a probable cause warrant signed by a federal judge saying, yes, you can go in and search and find this person? Because they didn't have probable cause. That's why. They couldn't get probable cause. So they tried to make up their own warrants, these so-called administrative warrants, and they waited outside of restaurants for the place to close. I read today they're going to bus stops. They're going to bus stops and they're questioning children waiting for a bus. Sickening. I mean, so why are they doing this? Well, if you are again, I hate to put myself in this position, but if you are in their positions, you're under pressure to follow those orders. And again, we'll see if the Democrats with their 10 calls for reform, and as far as they go, good. far as they go. Take off the masks. And some Republicans are arguing that will endanger the ICE agents if they take off their masks. Put on identification. All of our state and local law enforcement have to be identified. The cars have to be identified with license and all the rest. So that's a decent little start. They said that they would tell them to take off. I don't know if it's happening. The body cameras. Well, that's also fine because George Floyd, if the people had not been videotaping, who knows if there would have been any accountability. And in our state, it's well known. It is well accepted by the police to have the body cameras and turn them on. It took a little while to get people used to that because they now realize they can be held accountable because there's a videotape. But it's the law here. And yet they came in and thought they could do things behind closed doors or whatever, and they would get away with it. And so there's a bunch of reforms, and they're all training, obviously, stop the racial profiling, indiscriminate stopping. And if you do put somebody in custody, you better find out if they're a citizen or not. They held some citizens for hours and hours. And so there's a bunch of things that are fine, but there's a bigger, and what I would say is it's an iceberg. So the 10 reforms are up here at the tip of the iceberg. What you can see, there's a bigger thing underneath. And the bigger problem underneath that I'm not hearing any Democrats talk about, and there's a couple of things, are the numbers. 22,000 ICE and 20-some thousand. What? Even if they were to say, even miracle, they said ICE out of Minnesota. If Holman, it ain't going to happen. But if Holman was to say, 700 reduction is not enough, we're going to say all ICE out of Minnesota. Guess what? They're going to go to other states. And so the same thing is going to be happening in Colorado and Maine and Texas and California, every place, California.
Yeah.
So, and you would hope that the rest of the country sees that what's happening here and is prepared for that, because it will happen to some extent. But that's the bigger problem. What do you do with all of those people you hired in 1 year? They probably have 20, 25-year careers ahead of them. They can't easily be fired without cause. They can't just say, well, we all decided now ICE is no good. That can't happen. There's 22,000 of them. Could we come up with a new job, a new role or something maybe? But other than that, that's a huge problem. The other and the bottom of this iceberg is that example set by the war on terror, and that has taken at least 5 million lives all over the Mideast, also now in Ukraine, and threatening, and Venezuela, and now spread, past the Mideast. But that war on terror and that acceptance of even genocide. So when I saw little 5-year-old Liam, the little cute boy, with the hat, and I thought to myself, you know what? Why don't they look at this little boy and at least feel a little sorry when they just taking his father and his mother's inside. He's all alone. And you know what? I think there's a lot of desensitization from the genocide in Gaza. People now say, oh, well, he's a little terror. He's a little illegal immigrant. So what's it? And that what they said in Israel, oh, well, they're little baby terrorists. Amalek, kill all the children. It's pretty incredible. But that horror, the fact of going down to this extremely low line level has seeped into consciousness. And so if you're going to be paid $50,000 and $200, by the way, that bonus was ended. I'm not sure. Maybe there are still some bonuses involved, but you also make your career that way by the number of arrests. Even in the FBI, we got statistics. That's how we got performance graded, is number of arrests. And so that's when you had your performance appraisal. That's what they looked at. So even if it's not just monetary, there's other career incentives for numbers over the actual quality of what the law enforcement mission is. which is, obviously if somebody has a murder, a criminal history, that is very different than somebody who's working hard and here for 20 years. Very different. And Trump didn't explain this. He made it seem like, that and that's why I think his base, was voting for it initially. They didn't realize how it would play out.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with everything that you've said. We have a lot still to talk about. We're just scratching the surface of this whole ICE incursion here in Minneapolis and what the ramifications of that really mean. But a lot has happened in the month of January and even into this month of February. From the very beginning of this year, I would say like the last month has felt like a whole decade of political things that have happened, from ICE being unleashed onto our streets here in Minneapolis and in some other states. And then we have the President Trump kidnapping Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. We have Israel pushing Trump to bomb Iran and to go to war with Iran. And we have this expansion of the surveillance Palantir system that's literally in the hands of these ICE agents to create a database of Americans, similar to how Israel uses face scanning cameras in the West Bank. And it's like this is the same company, by the way, the same tech giant that helped Israel create an AI kill list to be used in Gaza. And what else do we have, Coleen? We have so many things that have happened.
These are...
Oh, the Epstein files. And we have like the release of the 3.5 million Epstein files that have been released, which apparently are still only like less than 5% of what the Epstein files are. And it's almost like the Trump administration has kind of like lifted the mask off of what U.S. imperialism truly is. Obviously, somebody like me or you have been reporting on this. We've been studying this for over a decade. We know about these policies, but it's almost like they're just showing us exactly who they are and telling us like there's nothing that you can do about it. That's what it feels like. And then, we just reported just in the last week of Fort Bragg, these military members who served in Afghanistan who have been sex trafficking young boys in America. And they were doing the same thing in Afghanistan by trafficking young Afghani boys. And so I see like the Epstein file release as just an extension, of course, of all of these policies across the board, from the sex trafficking and the, crimes that the U.S. military has committed overseas, not being held accountable, to all of these outrageous things that are happening now out in the open. And of course, if we look back even just to the genocide in Gaza, it was the Biden administration and the Trump administration that allowed this genocide to continue. And they killed our children. They blew our children to pieces. They leveled Gaza. They created such horrific crimes in front of the cameras, and no one was held accountable. Yeah, no one.
Not yet. The problem is timing. Like we were talking about 9/11, things take a while. You rarely get something where, it would be nice. It would be nice if there could be some kind of much more immediate accountability, but that doesn't the way life is. Even a criminal prosecution can take, months and years actually, and then it can get turned over. What's it called? When the judge reverses it and has to have another trial. You're the victim of this and you say, oh my gosh, it's 3 or 4 years. And that's the way it is. It is sad. I don't think it's not never. If we survive a potential World War III, if we are able somehow to, because there's real dangers now with this lack of accountability. And we always knew that if there is no accountability for serious crime, it tends to continue. It not only continues, but because there's no deterrence, you get more people following the cue. Crime is contagious. That was a famous quote from our Supreme Court justice in the 1920s. He said, when the government becomes the wrongdoer, it's the most dangerous thing, because crime is contagious. And for better or for worse, it's the teacher of all people. And, you start down that road and you end up with what happens in many empires that go down: lawlessness, complete lawlessness. You saw it with the Roman Empire. And, these sex crimes of Epstein are a great example because, everyone's horrified by knowing that this could have gone on. I saw today a female, a middle-aged female, I think she's a senator or a congresswoman, and she had initially come out and said, she's Republican. So initially had come out and said, oh, I don't see what the big deal is about the Epstein files. I don't care about that, whatever. And today, now having finally seen some of the release of the emails, she's completely reversed herself. Oh, I'm ashamed, that I said that. And, of course, this is horrible, whatever. So when information comes out, it's the rationale for having a free press. It does take time, but when information comes out and people finally learn the truth about things, some things can change. And I think there is a chance. I mean, like I said, the glimmer of hope is the judges themselves. A lot of the judges are smart. And, in law school, we all went through this criminal justice theory about carrot and stick. So you want to reward good, honest, lawful behavior, and you want to punish people from doing things like murder and rape and abusing children and whatever. Well, and we do that because not only to punish that person, but to keep that person. Epstein was allowed to continue. Unbelievable. He was convicted one time and he was allowed to continue for years. That's incredible. I mean, that just shows how much power that he had at the time. And then finally, the second time when they caught him, then they finally were putting him in prison and he ended up dead. But I mean, it's incredible. But you stop the person himself, but you also then deter those actions, those criminal actions on the part of others. If you have nothing like that, and again, it becomes normalized. So when people are in Afghanistan and they say, oh, look at the Afghan people, what they're doing with the little boys and whatever. That was kind of fun. Let's try that back at home. And that's the problem. This lack of deterrence now even of the law. And and I think, frankly, some of that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, but I would think that some of those assistant U.S. attorneys who walked out remember those lectures from criminal justice, that you end up with an entire country falling apart if you cannot even uphold your laws. And you're right. It's not a secret now. There are tweets from these people saying, well, we used to follow the law, but now we don't have to anymore. The law was just that, and after 9/11, there were some statements made. The Constitution is just suicide. We can't make the Constitution a suicide pact. It's arcane. And I follow a lot of the legal developments of like the people that came up with imperial presidency. That was John Yoo, one of our old law professors, Robert Delahunty. They wrote books on imperial presidency. So their theory is that in a time of war, it's an emergency. Well, we're 25 years, emergency, 25 years, nonstop, perpetual war creates an emergency. And in it, when you have an emergency, you don't have to follow, for starters, what they call the Bill of Rights. First Amendment, freedom of press, freedom of speech. Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. Fifth Amendment, the laws about not coercing. Obviously, we tortured confessions out of people or false confessions out of people. So all of those laws are said to go into the back seat. They don't really, we're in an emergency. We can't worry about those anymore. And there's books written on that theory of imperial presidency. John Yoo spoke at one of our law schools here. I went and protested him in the front row when he was speaking. And his speech was, only the great presidents in history are war presidents. And, cause and then at the end I go, but how long will this was about 2010, I think. And I raised my hand. I said, but how long is the emergency going to go on for? Because it was already 9 years at the time. And he goes, well, it'll end sometime. And here we are, 2026, and it's still still going on. And this means that the law is, these people in power. Epstein obviously thought he could get Ghislaine Maxwell, thought they could all get it. And all of the people that were enamored of Epstein, this kind of cabal. I don't know what, I think that someone called it the Epstein Club or the Epstein cabal. It's all very powerful people of all different walks around the world. He was networking and making lots of money doing that, but setting up people, even Noam Chomsky, for heaven's sakes. I mean, when I first saw that about Noam Chomsky, I kind of had my doubts about him anyways, as he got older, especially, that he wasn't thinking too clearly. But I also know that people are drawn like moths to the light to power. And you'd be surprised that people, how they change so quickly with money and power being available. And so, he was very successful. And when he could get these people to the island, people like Dershowitz and Woody Allen and Clinton and all these people, it's shocking right now. But maybe we need to be shocked. Maybe more of the country and in Great Britain, they fired now. Did you hear this latest? They fired their ambassador to the United States because he was found in the Epstein files. And he was their main ambassador. He was appointed by the prime minister and he got fired now. So maybe these things, again, unraveling as they are, it's horrible to look at, but maybe ultimately it will be something good. And I am very supportive of Tom Massey and Ro Khanna and the others who have voted for the release of these. Again, they're horrible, icky things, but the need for accountability is so huge on this thing. And it's not just Epstein. He's dead, of course. It's all of the rest. Ghislaine Maxwell's still trying to get out. She got put, unbelievable. She's in a minimum security prison now because of her probably threatening Trump. Probably there is a lot of blackmail going on because everybody knows who else is involved. Bannon. I mean, all these people that know. And then I read yesterday, I read that Trump was in an interview at the first time or a long time before, or maybe it was the second time that Epstein was arrested, but he was interviewed by a chief of police and he did say something like, well, it's about high time that you caught him. Everyone knows what he's been doing. So after he said, no, I had no idea.
And why do you think that the media, especially the British media, even though they fired their ambassador, are trying to point Jeffrey Epstein to a Russian asset, not an Israeli asset? I mean, we've interviewed former Israeli Mossad at MintPress through, our journalist Whitney Webb at the time. I think it was 2018 or 2019. I think his name was Ben Menashe. He did an interview with Whitney. And he said that Epstein is an Israeli spy.
Well, there's too much coincidence. You have to be careful of so-called conspiracy. I'm the first one to warn people to be careful of some of these things when there's not hard smoking gun evidence of it. However, when there is real solid evidence, and in this case, the connection right off the bat between Ghislaine Maxwell and Robert Maxwell and working for Israel and the Mossad and everything. And that's well established. That alone, not to mention Ehud Barak coming many, many times. And now what you're seeing in the files being released and everything. So, I mean, he also, though, and of course, to try to smear Russia, well, that goes back to Russiagate. That was a lie, a false smear on Trump. There's enough criticism of Trump that making up that he was being blackmailed by Russia back in 2016. I mean, why did you have to go that far? That came from Clinton's. And then all of our intelligence agencies, all of them ran with it. Brennan, Clapper, all went on the talking heads every day, lying about Trump's connection as working for Russia. And now they're trying to say Epstein was. I mean, what we should be very skeptical of a repeat lie. I would say it's one thing if you fell for it once, but I mean, it's the same lie coming out a second time. There's no excuse for falling for that same thing a second time.
Well, even Benjamin Netanyahu has tweeted that that Epstein is not a spy for Israel.
Yeah.
How could you believe such a thing?
Yeah. Well, he did things, there's spying. I mean, there's different, even in the CIA, there's the covert operators, but there's also people that they pay, just like in the FBI, informants and assets and all the rest. So you can work part-time. I mean, you can do things and you might be in the hip pocket or whatever they call them. So yes, certainly. I mean, and then you look at what he said, Epstein and with Woody Allen, all of the people that he associated with. I mean, it was clearly for the benefit, and Ghislaine Maxwell, clearly for the benefit of Israel. A lot of his actions and getting power, that honeypot stuff, which is a old tried and true technique of spyware or whatever. So pretty women, what was it, Mata Hari in the years, hundreds of years ago or whatever. So the use of women to compromise men or, of course, kids or whatever, something even worse, has been used forever. And once you have that, now you own that person. It's done. It's done by our CIA. It's done by everybody. So the thing is too, what Epstein was doing was on a parallel with the tried and true spyware of not just the CIA, but all through hundreds of years. This has been done to try to get blackmail. And in politics, that business of collecting the dirt on people, if I talk to somebody who's going to run for Congress, the first thing you want to ask is, well, okay, what dirt do you have? What have you done in the past that you are not proud of? And you're okay with that being made public. Because if you become powerful and you go for president, look at and some of it's fake. Some of it's just complete lies. Like Clinton's was a lie about Trump. They made up the dossier. The Steele dossier is totally fabricated. But usually they don't have to fabricate. Mm-hmm. If you are a friend of Epstein or whatever, they're going to have a lot of stuff on you. Well, then right off the bat, your politics is compromised because you're owned by others. There's a couple ways. You buy somebody with money, with campaign, or you own them by knowing their deepest, darkest secrets that they don't want known.
Coleen Rowley, thank you for speaking up and for always fighting for justice. And we're proud to have you here in Minneapolis as a whistleblower turned anti-war activist. And you've always been such a huge advocate for Palestinian human rights. And it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for letting me talk for this long. Sorry I talked this long.
That's okay. Thank you so much.